Thank you very much for coming along tonight. The title, In Search of Past Times, is Fake Pseudo-Pretentious Proustian and doesn't really give you very much indication as to what's actually going to happen. But really, it's in search of past times for me to be nostalgic about the things that I've enjoyed teaching, and hopefully for some of you to actually remember some of the lessons that you might have had 20, 30, 40 years ago. And the film you just watched might have been potentially very, very, very embarrassing for at least two people here tonight, because that film was made at Bodiam Castle in 1968, and it involved us going down and staying there and making a film about medieval pages, and two of the pages are somewhere hiding at the moment in the audience. So what I'm going to be doing is to try and just show you some of the things that you might remember, but I want to do more than that. What I want to actually do is to try and explain what actually is the reasoning behind why I have taught in the way that I apparently have taught, and also why I've taught particular kind of themes. So you're going to get a kind of rationale of what I think I've been doing, and whether you actually recognized it at the time or whether you recognize it now, I'll hear about afterwards. But basically, I came to this school in the 60s, and Graham Behrman and I were two new young history teachers, and the way that history was taught in the school changed a lot because of the new sort of 60s ideology. The head of history then was a man called George Offaler, who was incredibly nice and very learned, but he had a particular reputation for teaching in a particular kind of way. The Vandal headmaster, Maurice Isaac, destroyed the secret history of the school in the 70s because there used to be old wooden desks, and he replaced them with graffiti-free plastic ones. And in so doing, he actually destroyed the undercurrent of the history of the school, because engraved onto the desks was the underground history of Latymer Upper. And in the history rooms, there was a particular little saying there that was there all the time, and loads of the desks had carved on them, Offaler the Waffler. And the reason for that was because of his teaching method. He knew a lot, and he would arrive in a lesson, and he would speak. And you would sit down as the students, and you would write things down. And you would learn a lot, and you would do very well, and you'd get very interested in history. But that isn't actually what was fashionable in the 60s, and isn't the way that any school subject nowadays would probably be taught. Therefore, what we were doing was to introduce a more kind of interactive kind of teaching. And I'm going to claim that it actually has very ancient kind of origins. I think it's what's called Socratic maieusis. And that term might not be familiar to you. You've probably come across more often the Socratic elenchus, which is where it's like a Monty Python sketch, and you say something in the lesson, and I say, why? And you then have to justify it, and I say, why? And I just go on disagreeing with you continuously for a whole lesson. And I certainly am notorious for sometimes having tried to do that in debate. But the Socratic maieusis is different. The image on the screen is vaguely relevant because maieusis is the Greek for to give birth. And that is a medieval picture that shows you actually how different it was for people to give birth in those days. You didn't lie down. You sat on a stool and it dropped out, as you can see. And therefore, Socratic mimesis was the notion that somehow, by asking questions, you could get people to give birth to new ideas. Now, the real Socratic mimesis was based on sort of Platonic ideas of having knowledge in your head that was already there and just need to be revealed, whereas what I was doing was to try and not tell you things, but to get you to think of things as if for yourself by asking questions. The great problem if you're a history teacher is that by inevitably you know a lot more about the concepts and about the information of the history that you're studying than the students can possibly know. And the danger is that you simply tell them things and they write it down, like in the Offler method. Whereas the idea of asking questions is that you get a sequence of questions going where you gradually lead people to think they've come up with the idea that you as the teacher already wanted them to actually have. And therefore, you give birth to thinking. And that's what I've always hoped I would do in the way that I do lessons. So lessons hopefully have been interactive, which is what tonight can't really be, without the threat of embarrassing all of you individually, extensively, which I'm not going to do. You may also obviously remember that I've always had images. Last year I've moved to this iPad and its technical wizardry and so on, and it really does work, and it really is good. But I used to show lots of slides, and there was a rationale behind why I used so much visual imagery. The rationale derives from really quite old ideas in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, they used to have what are called emblem books. This is Andrea Anciati's emblems. And in an emblem book, what you did was to actually try and give an individual their own personal emblem. And in it, you'd have a text, which is, as you can see at the bottom of the image, and then above it, there is the image itself. And they argued that books should be produced like this because of the impact of the image. The image is going to actually have a more direct impact than words ever can. And that's what I believed is happening in lessons. If you give kids lots of text and they ask them to interpret it, it takes a lot of time. You put an image on a screen and kids will look at it and they will immediately have a reaction to it and want to say things about it and ask questions about it. Therefore, I think that images are a very good way of teaching everything, especially teaching concepts in history. And this idea is also actually present in Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was involved in what's called the Paragone, which was the dispute between writers and artists as to whether actually art and literature or painting was actually better. And he argued that visual images are the best thing to use. And this is a copy of a lost painting by Leonardo called The Battle of Anghiari. And you can see there that he is trying to give you the sort of impact of what the battle was like. And he claimed that visual images have a greater impact than words ever can. So art is the prime art of all the things in art's world. But my ideas also have been influenced by some medieval theology. And I think I'm approximately about 800 years out of date in the sort of way in which I have wanted to teach. You can go back to the year 1260 and you can read a writer called the Pseudo Bonaventura, who was a Roman Catholic theologian. And he, in his book, wrote about why there should be pictures in churches. And he was basically talking about the Biblia Pauperum, the way in which there should be pictures for the illiterate. And he begins with a text about how, and for the simple, pictures are necessary. And if you show that to a group of 11-year-olds, they feel grossly insulted because they're definitely being compared to simple peasants. But I would still argue they can get a lot out of the pictures. But he then goes on to say that there's more to it than just that. There was what was called the art of memory, whereby actually you try and remember things visually. And I think that is actually something that happens to people, that you may well see images tonight that I put up on the screen that you last saw 20, 30 years ago, and they might well strike a chord with you. And he also used the word to represent. And he said that he wanted art to actually represent things to people who couldn't read the Bible, and he wanted to actually make it so that you felt as though you were actually present at the very event that was being described. And that is the origin, I would say, of why this artist Giotto developed the new technique, where in the early Renaissance they began to make pictures much more realistic. And consider what the word to represent actually means. To represent, to be present again at. And that is what actually this writer Bonaventura wanted to happen. He wanted paintings to make you feel as though you were actually there. And this is the lamentation over the body of Christ in the Arena Chapel in Padua. And you've got Christ dead. And then you see how much care Giotto has put into actually showing the reactions of all the figures, the kind of body language. And therefore the way in which he hopes that actually you can get people to really feel the very feelings that are in the story. And that's what I think you should try and do in a history lesson. You want to make people feel as if they're present actually in the past. And this was also an idea that Leonardo had. And what Leonardo did was to claim that actually you should make someone, if you are painting a battle like the Battle of Anghiari, feel as if they're present in the middle of the battle. This image here is not by Leonardo. This is by Altdorfer, and it's a magnificent painting. And you can see the scale of the battle, you can see the scale of the geopolitical war that is going on, but are you going to actually empathize with what is happening in the battle? Whereas what Leonardo did is much more like what a film director now would do. Do you see he's not showing you the whole battle, he's gone into the close-up of the battle, and Leonardo wrote in his notebooks that again, what he wanted was you to see the expression of the characters in the picture and to feel what they were actually feeling. And he did lots of brilliant preparatory drawings where the soldier is crying out in anger. Or this one here is, I think, the most significant. This one is actually this guy just there. Do you see the man at the top who's got his sword and he's about to kill someone? Or is he about to be killed? And if you look at the face, isn't that exactly what you actually see? His mouth is open, he's shouting with anger, he's about to kill. But if you look into his eyes, isn't there also distinct terror there? And therefore, the idea of his painting was that you would actually feel that you were in the middle of the battle. And therefore, isn't this what you want to actually happen when you've got kids trying to find out about the past? And therefore, I believe that this combination of teaching through images and with the images being investigated by means of questions, you can get people into the mentality of people who existed in the past. And I can show you how it kind of works if you think of a picture like this. This is a painting that you might have seen in the National Gallery. It's by an artist in 1540 called Bronzino. It's possible that you actually recognize that bit, the foot, more than anything else. Because do you recognize that it comes from the openings of Monty Python? This is Terry Gilliam taking a little montage from here. And basically, what you've got is a complicated Renaissance Neoplatonic allegorical picture, and your job is to try and get 12-year-olds to actually understand what the picture is about. And you can simply ask them questions. If you go into slightly more close-up on the picture, you can begin to pick out the kind of things that actually show what the painting is about. And therefore, when you get to here, it's very obviously going to actually be about love, isn't it? This is actually Venus and Cupid, and there's a kiss. So therefore, it's going to definitely be about love, but it's got all these other strange things going on that just happen to be strewn on the floor, don't there? These masks. Now, if you go to Renaissance emblem books and read what the texts say, they say that masks are a very good way of symbolizing deception and falsity. And if you look at the actual woman in here, the woman, isn't she incredibly white? And you know how probably in the 16th century, women, and sometimes often men as well, put on lots of rather arsenical kind of lead-based makeups, which made their skin go very white, because there's only peasants who actually get sunburnt, isn't it? And therefore, you want to have white skin, but it's false. It's makeup, isn't it? And is that why, therefore, you've got these masks at the bottom here? And then, when you get to the old man here, the first thing that 12-year-olds will say is that he's Father Christmas. You then have to disabuse them by making them look at it, by actually observing what is there. Because as you go into close-up, that is definitely an egg timer, isn't it? And therefore, this is Kronos, this is Old Father Time. And then you make them look at the way in which there is actually a wing here that grows out of his back. And 12-year-olds definitely know, and they probably approve of, that little saying, when does time fly? When you're having fun. And therefore, what they do is to work out that this is actually about the couple here who are beginning to have fun. You can then see that there are other figures there. There is this man here, and he's very definitely tearing his hair out, isn't he? And there's a record from the first art historian, Giorgio Vasari, who says that Bronzino painted this picture, paid for by the Duke of Florence as a gift to the King of France, and in it was a figure of jealousy. And that presumably is what this figure actually is. And he's tearing his hair out, with jealousy at being displaced by a younger lover. But recent modern art historians have noticed there's something else. Jealousy doesn't actually make your teeth fall out, does it? And teeth have actually fallen out. And therefore, there is a new theory which says that actually this man gives you the clue as to what has happened to the other man. In the 16th century, in the early part of the 16th century, there were the Italian wars, and that caused an epidemic of syphilis. And syphilis was the big killer disease around, and therefore this man may be in agony, not just out of jealousy, but because he's also suffering from STD. And then you get another strange set of figures here. Vasari says that there are also piacere and fraude in the picture. And piacere, it means pleasure, and the little boy flowing the rose petals may well be meant to be the figure of pleasure. But then there's this girl, and if you go into close-up, her face is deliberately painted looking pretty sweet, isn't it? And then if you look at what she's holding, that it's difficult to make out, but that is actually a honeycomb. So she is apparently as sweet as honey, isn't she? But look lower down. And when you get to the lower half of her body, she's no longer as sweet as honey, is she? You see she turns into a snake, a serpent. Can you make out how actually she's then got furry legs and claws? And that means that she is actually probably what is called a chimera in Greek mythology. And you can also see something else that's peculiar about her, because if you look here, you see she's very definitely got below her foot a tail. And then the tail curves round. And when you get to here, do you see that she's actually holding her tail in her hand? And then do you see there's something at the end of the tail? And again, 12-year-olds will know the phrase. There is a sting in the tail. And is the syphilis the sting in the tail? And therefore, what you can do is to take all the different bits of this picture, all the different aspects of it, and from it you can then find the way in which the painting may have an actual meaning. And I would argue that that is the sort of thing that gets kids involved in a lesson. They will look at this picture, they will be puzzled by it. It's a detective story, an intellectual detective story, and they immediately start to have opinions about the image and start to develop their own interpretations, their own ideas. So I've always tried to use questions and I've always wanted to use images, but I've also thought that actually I don't like what much of conventional history is actually about. I don't think that the reasons that most people give as to why it's worth studying history are in themselves actually very worthwhile. If you believe the present Conservative government, if any of you are Govians, then you apparently think that history is all about knowing how you're British, how great Britain is. And that is obviously the worst possible kind of jingoism and not the sort of thing that this school has taught. We've tended to be Eurocentric in the way that we teach, and we want to teach more and more world history. So I think that I would completely reject that kind of history. I also reject the notion that actually you kind of learn lessons from history, which is what people conventionally say. I think that actually undermines the very notion that history is history, because history is constantly changing. So although you can see parallels, that something in the past might be called a revolution, it looks like a French Revolution looks like the Russian Revolution, actually that is the thing that is misleading, because you're not really studying the history and how things change all the time. And I also personally am not very interested in political history, and therefore I don't really believe in the kind of books that write kind of outline of the Conservative government of the 60s or the reign of Queen Elizabeth. And I think that that is actually more to do with fiction than history, because You have a time scale of Queen Elizabeth ruling for 50 years. You write this massive 600-page book, and you've just condensed 50 years into 600 pages. Therefore, you've inevitably been totally selective. You've picked out all the things that you think are significant, but that merely tells you about us in the year 2014 and how we view the past. And what I think most history books are, of political history, are actually fiction. They are simply made up. Therefore, what is the purpose, or what is the point of studying history? I'm a believer in the Annals school of history from the 60s, where they argued that history is alterity. And you can link that to Freudian and Kleinian notions of how actually you don't want to be solipsistic and always study yourself, and instead what you need to do is to reach out and discover the other. And what has always fascinated me in history has been otherness, the things that actually seem to me to be very strange. I'm not religious, but I've taught you a lot about medieval religion or about the Protestant Reformation. I totally do not believe in astrology, but I think that kids find it very interesting and strange. I don't believe in witchcraft, but I am interested to find out why people in the past believed in it. And there is a way in which I think it can actually fascinate kids to study it. But are you aware of what fascination really is? This is Johann Frohman in 1674, who wrote a book called De Fascinatione, which is a book about fascination. And it shows you the real original meaning of the word fascination, coming from a Latin word fascinum, so it was a Roman belief. And this is a witch, according to this picture, who is fascinating this baby. But fascination doesn't mean it in the modern sense at all. It's actually what you probably already know about as the evil eye. And there was a theory that a witch could simply look at you, and by looking at you, she could harm you, and babies were said to be particularly vulnerable, and therefore you have this as the image of how the witch is going to harm her victim. But then you've got to look at the medieval science and understand actually why they believe this. This is biological textbook, and you try and get them to remember their biology lesson and how an eye actually works, and how in modern science they're taught about the theory of intromission, that at the moment I can't see much of you because the lights are down, and you can see me because there's light, it reflects off my shirt, goes into your eye, and you see me. But the medieval theory of eyesight was different. I am at the moment sending out eye beams. My eyes are beaming out there. There are rays coming out from my eyes. They hit you, they come back, I see you, and that then explains, doesn't it, why fascination should have been actually possible. Because here is this witch pointing, looking, and there's evil inside her. She's possessed by the devil, and therefore this poor baby is in real danger. But there are things that you can actually do about it. So if you next time get pregnant, all you need is a mirror. And while you're pregnant, you wear that over your belly, and then you can reflect back the evil ray and actually get rid of it. And you may have actually seen portraits of children like this. And these sorts of portraits of children are obviously from very rich families, and you can see that they've got lots and lots of jewellery there. But actually, one of the reasons why they have so much jewellery is because it is apotropaic, which means that it's actually designed to divert and get rid of the evil eye. A witch's evil eye will be attracted by the glint of gold, will be attracted by the glint of the jewel. But of course, when the rays from her evil eye hit it, the jewel is cut so that they will actually be deflected, and therefore the baby will survive. And therefore, lots of the jewellery in these paintings isn't just decoration. It is not just bling. It is actually part of their belief system. So I believe that what you should do is to try and get people fascinated in history by its otherness. And therefore I believe in teaching the past as a strange world, another world, a lost country of alterity, where you come across all these strange things that you no longer believe. And I think that's why history is important to people, particularly as they're growing up, because I take an analogy from medieval theology. God is perfect. You and I are imperfect. By definition, we cannot conceive of how perfect God is. We can't actually see him. You shouldn't imagine him as a little old bearded man and so on. Therefore, what can you do to actually know God? And there was a specific kind of theology in the Middle Ages called apophatic theology. And apophatic theology said, you can't describe God because God is so perfect. All you can do is to be negative and say what God is not. And therefore, you work out that God is not evil, and therefore you begin to realize the goodness of God, and so on. And I think that's what actually happens in history. You lot were adolescents when I was teaching you, and you were beginning to separate away from your families, and you were beginning to form your own identity. And I believe that history really is important for kids in schools growing up, because I think it's one of the ways in which they can actually establish their own personal identity. They look at the past, and they look at a set of beliefs, astrology or something, and they laugh at it, they mock at it. That's what kids nowadays will do. In which case, they've just begun to define themselves, haven't they? They're beginning to say that those superstitious beliefs that were around in the Middle Ages are not what I am today. And therefore, that's why I think that alterity is very important in history. That you actually study the past and you find out what you are by realizing you're not the same as these distant, strange people with these strange beliefs in the past. Now that then has led me to want to actually go in for a particular kind of theme when I am teaching. So I fear that your political education was neglected by the way I taught you, and I don't do that much on political history because it doesn't personally interest me, and I don't think that it's easy for kids at 11 or 12 to sort of identify with the big political ideologies. And therefore, what I think you should do is to choose the themes and topics that you teach to people by what the characteristics are of their personality at a particular age. And I half believe in a strange 19th century biological theory which says that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And if you're not familiar with 19th century biology, you may not realize that the 19th century biologists thought there was a distinct parallel between how the fetus in the womb evolves into a human being and how the human race has actually evolved. And there are some really sad, strange books written by Victorian clergymen and so on, which talk about the childhood of the world. And what they do is they look back on so-called primitive people and they say that this is them in an early stage of childhood. Then they probably get onto the Enlightenment and rationalism and science, and they say that this is the individual actually developing into a good person and using rational knowledge. And then they're probably very racist in the way they view things because they tend to associate the primitive in terms of people from the past with other races in the world that they encountered in the 19th century as anthropologists and say that they're all like children. And that then evolution hasn't yet happened, whereas we, the British, with our empire and our power in the 19th and 20th centuries, are the peak of evolution. Now, I don't want to believe in that, but I do believe that actually you can see certain parallels between certain periods of history and the psychology of the people that you're teaching. So I've always thought that actually at the end of childhood, just before adolescence, year 7, 11, 12-year-olds, I think that they are ready to look at and try and understand a lot of aspects of medieval history. I think if you look at the way in which kids get, at that age, very keen on sport, the way in which they're very combative in sport, then it's very much comparing rugby and football and cricket to jousting in the Middle Ages. And therefore, there's a sort of parallel between their aims in sport, where they're trying to prove themselves and achieve things, and they can see the same thing in the way in which knights used to fight. And codes of honour are the sort of thing that little schoolboy gangs at the age of 11 or 12 are going to have. Then I have always thought that it was good to move on to, in sort of year 8, when they're about 12 or 13, teaching the Renaissance. Because in the Burckhardt 19th century view of the Renaissance was the discovery of the world and man, where people become much more conscious of themselves, self-conscious, and therefore start to write autobiographies. They start to want to have portraits of themselves, and therefore they get a much greater sense of their individual worth. And I think that's what is actually happening to people in adolescence. And therefore you can show them Renaissance artists, Renaissance lives, and they can kind of identify with the kind of heroism that Renaissance people often thought they could achieve by their actions. Whereas by the time they get to year 9, when they're 14 or 15, their conceptual development means that then I think they are actually ready for more ideological history. So that by the time they're in year 9, the old fourth forms, then what the history department would do would be to introduce them to nationalism, imperialism, communism, capitalism, the isms, where they're actually going to get involved in beliefs in political ideologies. And if you try to do that with 11-year-olds, I don't think that they would usually be that interested. Whereas about 14 or 15 and then into the sixth form, that is the very stuff of the kind of history that they like to actually study. Therefore, I think that history is very important for your and their psychological development. And that means that I've always thought that you should pick on not a chronological narrative of kings and queens, not a narrative of political history or wars, but what you should do is to pick out themes that are going to have an emotional impact on people and actually affect how they view the world. And therefore, the themes that I've organized to teach around have been basically themes of what I see as the core of life and the sadness and the core of death. And therefore pick out things from periods which I think particularly emotionally might relate to people. So I've always thought that chivalry was something that linked in very well to year 7 kids, and therefore if you're looking at chivalry, you can show them glorious battle scenes where you have heroic jousting going on, where you have people fighting against each other, where you have horses riding at each other, knights jousting, they kill each other with lances snapping, blood and brains spewing out, and therefore they get very involved in watching films about reconstructions of jousts and so on. And therefore they identify with this kind of warrior life that these people, some of them in the aristocracy, lived, but they also quite identify with courtly notions of love. And therefore, I would always want to pick out themes like love as something that you should actually study the history of. So you take a picture like that, and this is courtly love. And this is quite close to what girls at the age of 11 in this school at the moment would hope that actually meeting their first boyfriends and courting is actually going to be about. So it's actually in a courtyard, isn't it? And what your boyfriend should be doing is to court you by sitting in a pleasant garden, playing some music to you, singing a love song to you, and then perhaps giving you a present where this is the actual love song that they actually give you, so that you get it in a beautiful heart shape, like on a Valentine's Day, and you have the music there, and you have the courting couple. And that kind of glamorized romance is what 11-year-olds' view of love might well be like. And it's also, arguably, the basis of medieval romances. But you can also introduce them to sort of some complications in those kind of relationships. Because you have here a little plate which is about courtly love. And as you can see, all the men around, they're all gazing up at the planet Venus in the sky, which is the planet that brings about love. And therefore, lots of medieval romances are about love stories. But most of the love stories are not actually going to be about happy married bliss, because you can produce a case, and there's some evidence for it probably, that actually quite a lot of marriages, both with peasants and also in the aristocracy, were going to be arranged marriages. They're always shocked when they see a picture like that, which is apparently them. The boy looks about 12, doesn't he? And he is apparently getting married, and the marriage will have been arranged. So it introduces and brings in a discussion about whether marriages should be arranged or not, because they would have come across how in parts of Asia and so on, arranged marriage still goes on, and they'll have opinions about it. Therefore, you're bringing them into a question about love and marriage, which does actually relate to them. But then, if they're not actually going to have a married partner, then the medieval romances are usually going to be actually about actually finding yourself a mistress. And this is a little series of pictures from a medieval romance where boy meets girl. To their surprise, the person in the window is actually a man. Then he sees the girl riding past, and then you can see there is literally a love bond developing. That is literally tying the knot, isn't it? Which is the origin of the old modern phrase. And therefore, they have fallen in love. But they are probably already married at an early age, and therefore, in the story as it continues, they have to arrange secret meetings. So the man told his wife that he was going out hunting today. The wife told the husband that she was actually going out to pick flowers in the woods, but then they're able to meet. And then these stories often become kind of joke stories, and this is the sad ending of one of these medieval romances. The woman wanted to meet her lover, but it was very difficult to get him into the castle. So she persuaded her husband that she definitely needed a new well to be dug and a fresh supply of water to be available to her. Then, of course, that actually becomes the means of access whereby the lover can be pulled up by the girl into her bedroom, and therefore they can apparently live happily ever after. But this is a joke story, and you've probably already guessed that there's going to be a sad ending, because unfortunately this morning the mechanism on the pulley has jammed. So how would you explain to your husband why there is actually a man in a bucket just outside your bedroom window? So you've then got to resolve this. And if it's a medieval romance, the way that you resolve it should be something like this, where you then fight, probably to the death, for the honour of actually either keeping your wife or the lover keeping his mistress. And therefore you can see a joust going on, and one kills the other, and it could be that the story goes to a happy ending where the mistress gets her lover, or it could be unhappy where the husband then has killed the lover and the wife is left unhappy. And this provokes furious discussion with modern girls at Latymer who now come into the school in co-ed at the age of 11 as to actually the way in which women are treated. Because in this particular series of stories, there's one of the stories that's got a really sad ending. Apparently, if you came home and you found your wife in bed with her lover, then it's perfectly okay to behead your wife. And that is what has actually happened. On the other hand, the man gets away with it, doesn't he? So do you see that you're actually introducing them to the notion of the double standard and the way that it's dominated history? And I'm afraid that the girls nowadays will protest continuously about actually the sexism of the Middle Ages, the misogyny of the Middle Ages, and we give them a whole series of homeworks where they read up about what is actually allowed by the Bible or what is allowed by law, and the extent to which wives have to promise to obey their husbands. They don't cherish their husbands, they love, honour and obey their husbands, don't they, in the marriage ceremony in the Middle Ages. And then husbands are allowed to beat their wives. And you get answers when they write it down where girls will furiously protest against this. And therefore, do you see how you can bring the history of the Middle Ages into actually what the contemporary world is about? And therefore, it raises relevant questions for them to debate. But this notion of the Middle Ages is arguably one that, again, produces some strange kind of situations. This is a strange picture for various reasons, one of which is that it's actually been sawn in half. It was painted on a wooden panel, and you're looking at the front of it, and then there's a back of it, and then an art dealer 100 years ago made money by sawing it down the middle, and you can see this bit in Strasbourg, and the next bit, the other part of the painting, is now in the Cleveland Museum in America. And basically, when you look at it, you get a kind of false impression probably about what is going on. This is very definitely nobles, isn't it? You can see that they're rich. They're meeting in a wood. When you go into more close-up, you're meant to probably work out what the conversation is about, actually from the hand gestures. And you see he's giving her, I think, a forget-me-not. So I think he's definitely promising eternal love. But at the same time, do you see how he's made a sort of little ring out of part of the stem of the flower? And they've both got rings on their fingers, but there's no guarantee but actually they're married to each other. They're married, but it's probably meant to be courtly love, where this is a knight and his mistress. And kids in this school definitely recognise the language of signs in the way that he is expressing. Because he's actually making that sign, isn't he, which they make in the playground. And what they're doing are to suggest that actually they're going to go and have sex in the woods. And therefore, this painting is apparently a happy medieval love story. But it isn't. Because the painting has a reverse. And I assume, there's not much proof for this, but I assume this painting would have been used by a preacher. And you've had this image, and you've just got you all excited by the happy love story. Then he'd say, and see what happens next. And you're getting really excited, like the kids in the class are. And this is what happens next. That is the back of the picture. And that is what happens next to unmarried lovers who behave like this. And therefore, you get this memento mori, this horrific image of how the body actually will be in their grave. They're not in hell, they're in their graves. You see, they've got winding sheets. They often weren't buried in coffins, they just had a cloth put around them. And they had a belief, a strange belief, in spontaneous generation. And there were various sorts of creatures that they actually believed were spontaneously generated by actually the putrefying of flesh. So, when you get to her, you can see that actually there are some maggots beginning to appear and eat her stomach. And if you lived in a medieval castle, you would not have had a fridge, would you? You've locked away your meat in a cupboard. It's a hot summer. You've left it. The door was shut. And then, when you open the door a week later, having forgotten it, the whole bit of meat is now crawling with maggots, isn't it? And they didn't have microscopes, so you wouldn't know that there were flies' eggs actually laid on the meat when you put it in. And therefore, there was a widespread belief in spontaneous generation. And therefore, you end up with this as the maggot that is born from the stomach. Some sorts of snakes were alleged to be born from the spinal cord. The decaying marrow in your spinal cord turned into a snake, and then, as you can see, it simply has to burrow its way out of you. And we're just not going to talk about the origin of Toad in the Hole. Therefore, you've got this as the medieval image of love, where they have ideals of love, but their religion, their Christianity, led them to be very negative about sex. And I would argue that you should show kids young a lot of images of exactly how horrified they were in the Middle Ages by death. In the Middle Ages, there were terrible situations of plague, weren't there, like in 1348. There were also various other ways in which life expectancy was very low. I would claim that probably average life expectancy in Britain up to about the 17th, 18th century is only about 28. That half of your kids would have been dead before they were 12, and therefore death is ever present. And I think you can see that in a magnificent painting like this. This is Peter Bruegel, and it's entitled The Triumph of Death. And you can see how triumphant death actually is. Death, as the Bible says, rides a pale horse. All flesh is as grass. And here comes the man with the scythe to cut you down in the very prime of your life. And then this is what you're up against, look. There is the army of death marching upon you and about to kill you. And the painting shows death in various different kind of ways. You get some figures like these, which are hideously emaciated and thin, because up until the 18th century, people were dying of starvation in Europe, not just in the rest of the world. Then you have situations like this, where you probably recognize that in the time when there's a plague epidemic, the only thing they could do to control it was to try and keep people in their houses, and then somebody came round saying, bring out your dead, and then a cart like this came and actually collected the dead bodies. And there's a Latymer historian, a guy called Barney Sloane, who's now an archaeologist at the Museum of London, and he's just done his research, and he's come up with new theories where he thinks that the so-called bubonic plague is not actually the killer disease in 1348, because with bubonic plague, it takes several days for you to die, and it would not spread all that rapidly. There's a variant of plague called pneumonic plague, and pneumonic plague is in your lungs and is, of course, spread by coughing and sneezing and so on. And he thinks that actually the reason why the epidemics in London in 1348 and 1665 were so horrific was because of the fact that it was actually pneumonic plague that caused the widespread epidemic. And then Peter Bruegel is painting in the Netherlands in the 1560s, and there were wars of religion going on. So he includes in here these horrific scenes of fighting and war, because war is another big killer. And then these deaths are for real. You get some people who are simply strung up on a gallows like that, some people who are simply beheaded, but then the wheel, this thing, did actually exist. You simply took a cartwheel, put it on a pole, and then you tied the victim on the wheel, and you left him there. And he died very slowly, in pain. And you left him there till the birds pecked away his flesh, and there was nothing left. And then you get this sort of garrotting on a tree like that. And therefore, you get a very strong sense, don't you, from a picture like this, of the reality of death. And then you can work out the attitudes that they actually had to it. Now that, I think, is a king, isn't it? And then next to him, do you see that there are loads and loads of barrels of money? And then do you see that broad-brimmed hat? I think that's a cardinal, probably. And there was a phrase in the Middle Ages, death is the great equalizer. You may be a king, you may be a cardinal, you may be rich on earth, but you're not going to actually survive death. You're just as likely to die from the plague as anybody else. And then look at what's happening to these people over here. You've got the lovers, and listen to the noise of the skeleton croaking and plucking away at that fake guitar behind him. And then at the table, you've got the man who is drawing a sword. He's going to fight death, isn't he? And he's sure to win. And why is he dying? I think if you look on the table, he's been eating and drinking too much. I think there are probably dice there, so he's been gambling. And then you can probably recognize that man there, can't you? That multicolored coat. He's the fool. Because when faced with death, what does the fool do? Tries to hide under the table. And therefore, I think you should take these archetypal situations of love and death, and that is what actually people need to see, how people in the past have reacted, how strange their beliefs are about why people die, how strange their beliefs are about love, and therefore study medieval history. But I'm going to finish by looking at how actually things change when you get to the Renaissance period. The Renaissance theory of love is going to be very different from the medieval one. You've heard a kind of negative version here. You can also get a different view of love presented in those fabulous paintings by Botticelli. This is the Botticelli Birth of Venus in the Uffizi, and you've got the goddess Venus being born. She is blown across the waves by the wind. Those figures there, you can see their cheeks puffing out. Those are zephyrs, and they blow her across the sea. And then she is greeted by goddess Flora, who is about to clothe her. And Botticelli not only did that painting, but also you probably know this, which is a painting called Primavera, painted by Botticelli in about the 1480s. And I would argue that this painting is again an allegory, probably a Neoplatonic allegory, and I think that it's best been explained by Ernst Gombrich, who was at the Courtauld and came over from Germany, and in the 1940s he wrote about and researched the symbolism of this painting, and I find his approach the most convincing one to explain what is going on. It is definitely about love, because Venus is in the center presiding over everything. Then above Venus, that is definitely Cupid, and he shoots out arrows, but you can see how he is what's called a blind Cupid. They often argue that the way in which people fall in love is very inexplicable, and it's as if you're suddenly struck by love, and therefore he is shown as a blind shooter of arrows, creating love. If you start on this side, that figure there is very easily recognizable. You saw him in the previous picture. This is definitely Zephyr, isn't it? You see he's got his cheeks blown out. Is this funny blue colour. And there is a myth in Ovid's Metamorphoses of how Zephyr fell in love with or fancied rather, I should say probably, this girl who is called Chloris. And he is, as you can see, attempting to grab her. Abduct, rape, those are possibilities. But the gods don't always allow other gods to do what they want. And as you probably know, Ovid's book of poems, The Metamorphoses, are about change. And look what's happening. Do you see out of her mouth, you've suddenly got all these plants and flowers appearing? And then she is metamorphosed into this figure, who we saw in the previous painting, who is very definitely Flora, isn't she? She's this goddess of flowers. And this painting is called Primavera. And unfortunately, the paint surface has deteriorated chemically, and that black stuff should actually be a rather beautiful green meadow from which the flowers come. So this is all about a painting about spring and love. But then you probably recognize who these people here actually are. These are the three graces, and they're the archetypal image of what people really enjoy in Botticelli. You have these beautiful faces. Then, as you probably know, Botticelli specialized in this kind of drapery, and it's very thin and diaphanous, and as you can see, it blows in the gentle spring breezes, but it does sort of cling to certain bits, doesn't it? And as you can see, it deliberately picks out what actually he wants you to admire in the women. And therefore, what are these women about? Edgar Vint, who was another court historian, discovered this medal. And this medal was produced in Florence in the 15th century and is also, as you can see, the three graces. But this one has got a very helpful inscription that goes around it. And it says amor, which is love. It says pulchritudo, which is beauty. And it says castitas, which is chastity. There's another set of texts which say that the three graces dancing together are meant to represent ideal beauty, an ideal love. And they dance in this timeless dance of perfect harmony, don't they? And then there's a bloke over here, isn't there? And if you look at his hat, do you see that he's got kind of wings? And then do you see at the bottom, he's got these sort of spring heels on him? And that probably means that you've got to identify him as Hermes or Mercury. The particular staff that he is holding is a stick with intertwining, it should be serpents, but they look a bit more like dragons in this particular painting. And you've probably heard of Mercury as the so-called messenger of the gods. And he is the person who links the gods and heaven to this world. But there was a writer in the 15th century called Marsilio Ficino who translated the works of Plato. He also wrote a book on Plato's theory of love called De Amore. And what he did in that was to claim that Mercury was going to be the inspirer of human beings and that he brought from the gods divine love. And if you look, do you see how his staff is reaching through the earthly world of the plant and the fertility? And do you see it's reaching into the clouds and through the clouds? And therefore, the Gombrich interpretation is that this painting is a hierarchy of love. Venus is the goddess of love, but there are various different sorts of love. There is the sexually aggressive that you've got on the right. There is the love of ideal beauty, which you've got in the three graces. Hermes is pointing your mind upwards to divine love. And therefore, I think this is about Plato's theory of love, which was being translated and read in Renaissance. But you probably have mostly come across a Victorian misconception about Platonic love. You think that Platonic love means what we would call kind of friendship, soul love, loving the personality, loving the mind, not the body, and no sex, please. But if you actually go to Plato himself, and if in particular you go to Ficino's explanation of Plato, Ficino's interpretation of Plato was that actually all forms of love are good. And therefore, there is a hierarchy. There are some forms of love that are better than others, but all forms of love are good, and therefore this is Venus presiding over them all, because the sexual aggression on the right turns into fertility, doesn't it? And spring, and the flowers grow. And therefore, sexual reproduction and fertility is part of human existence. There is then a search for an ideal beauty, like you can see in that. Then, according to Plato, your mind should rise up and should rise to divine. And in Plato, the divine plan is that we unite mind and body. And therefore, I've always thought that this was a really good allegory of the true Platonic theory of love. And if you use a visual image like this, and you break it down by questions into what are all happening in the different parts, then it's very easy for people at the age of 12, at the age of 18, to actually pick up and understand this really quite complicated Neoplatonic theory of love. And therefore, what I like to do is to try and pick on the big themes, the archetypes: life, love, and death. And those were the themes that I actually was teaching you in history lessons. And I was trying to show you the range of beliefs that have been through history that people have had about the big issues emotionally and psychologically that you would face. And hopefully you then look at these images, you look at these ideas, and you agree with them or you disagree with them, you identify with them or you reject them, and that means that you're developing your own attitude towards life and love and death. And that's why I think history is important. And I want to finish by taking an image by Michelangelo as my kind of emblem of what I would hope to do. An emblem in the Renaissance was your own personal expression of what you're trying to do. And this is a Michelangelo drawing. It's quite, again, complicated, but again, it makes sense. It was nicknamed 100 years later, the dream of human life. So you've got this youth who is kind of dreaming and waking up, and he's very definitely a man of the world, because he's lying literally on the world, isn't he? And then in the box below the world, you can recognize all that, can't you? And that is Mars again. Bronzino was actually a friend of Michelangelo, so the symbolism in both paintings is probably the same. And therefore, these are falsity. These are deception. And therefore, you have the young man, and the things around him may be meant to be what is deceiving him. Because there are actually 7 separate scenes here. Some of them are very obvious. That one there, do you see there's a big purse? And they're the 7 deadly sins. And this one presumably is greed. Then you get a couple of people sort of wrestling, and that's probably anger. Then over here, you get a couple embracing, and that's probably lust, isn't it? And these are the things that, according to Plato, and Michelangelo read Plato, he wrote poetry which was using Platonic ideas. He created sculptures that were using Platonic ideas. Therefore, Michelangelo was probably trying to put meaning into this of a Platonic sort. The world is full of deception. Do not actually simply live a life of sleep. You need to be awakened. And what is awakening you here is this figure. It's not an angel. It probably is actually Platonic. And in classical mythology, human beings had their own genius. And the genius was a kind of spirit that the Platonic world soul gave to you to wake you up, to make you into a person, to inspire you. And that word inspire literally is happening in this picture, because it comes from spirare, which is to breathe. And in Plato, what inspires you, what moves you to a divine frenzy, what turns you into a creative person, is literally inspiration. And obviously, that is what most teachers would actually hope their teaching is about, being inspirational. You literally breathe intellectual life into the people that you're teaching. And that is what I would always have hoped to have done. And therefore, I would just like to conclude by thanking the school for having given me the chance to teach so many interesting, nice and clever people, many of whom are here today. And for me to finally say how much I've loved teaching as a career, and how much I've loved teaching many of you. So thank you very much for coming along tonight.